I do not remember the exact moment when I lost myself. I only remember that one day I woke up and felt that everything was right, yet wrong in a very deep way. I had a job, I had a schedule, I had stable relationships. But when I sat alone with no noise, no screens, no one needing me to play any role, I no longer knew who I was. Not in a panicked way, but in a very calm emptiness. I still smiled at the right moments. I still said the appropriate things. I still did what needed to be done. It was just that I was no longer present in my own life. I used to think that losing yourself only happened after major shocks. A crisis. A failure. A pain strong enough to break a person. But later, I understood something very different. Most of us do not lose ourselves in a single moment. We lose ourselves through very small compromises. One time staying silent instead of telling the truth. One time choosing softy instead of what we believe in. One time telling ourselves it is fine while something inside quietly dies. And then again and again. Until one day, you no longer remember who you were before you started adapting. There is a truth that is very hard to accept. People do not lose themselves because they are weak. They lose themselves because they are very good at adapting. You learn how to be agreeable. You learn how not to cause trouble. You learn how to fit in. At first, this is a survival skill, but slowly it becomes identity. And when that happens, your real self is pushed into a very deep, very quiet corner. It does not disappear. It is simply no longer listened to. I remember a period when every time I faced even a small decision, I no longer asked myself what I wanted. I asked what was more reasonable, what was less risky, what would make others more satisfied. And the question, what do I want, gradually became so unfamiliar that when it appeared, I did not know how to answer it. That was the first sign of losing myself. Not when I was in pain, but when I could no longer clearly feel what belonged to me. You live a life that is correct, but not real. And the exhaustion that comes from that is deeper than any pressure. In the next part, we will go deeper into the psychological mechanism behind this. Why people slowly become adaptive versions of themselves instead of their real selves. And why finding yourself again is not about adding more, but about daring to look straight at what you have left behind. Most people believe that finding themselves means discovering something new, a passion, a purpose, a hidden talent, but that belief is what keeps them lost. You do not lose yourself because you lack something. You lose yourself because you abandoned something. And the longer the abandonment lasts, the harder it becomes to hear what is still there. The real self does not disappear dramatically. It fades quietly. It becomes a background signal, easily drowned out by responsibilities, expectations, and the noise of everyday life. You stop asking yourself honest questions because honest answers would require change. You stop listening to discomfort because it interferes with stability. You stop noticing emptiness because you can always stay busy. And that is how disconnection becomes normal. There is a psychological mechanism behind this. The human mind is deeply rewarded by approval. From a very young age, you learn that being accepted feels safe. Being rejected feels dangerous. So you adapt. At first, you adjust behavior. Later, you adjust opinions. Eventually, you adjust identity. You tell yourself that this is who you are now. More mature, more practical, more realistic. But what you often mean is more distant from yourself. There is a man named Aaron. He once loved drawing, not because he wanted to be an artist, but because it made him feel alive. Over time, people told him it was not useful, not practical, just a hobby. So he stopped. Nothing bad happened immediately. Life continued. Responsibilities increased. But years later, Aaron could not explain why he felt numb, why everything felt flat. He assumed something was wrong with him. Nothing was wrong. Something was missing. Finding yourself does not start with asking what you want to become. It starts with asking what you stopped allowing yourself to be. What did you silence because it did not fit? What did you abandon because it was inconvenient? What part of you learned to stay quiet to survive? These questions are uncomfortable because they bring grief. Grief for choices made by unconsciously, grief for parts of yourself that waited patiently and were ignored. But that grief is not a weakness. It is a signal. A signal that something real still exists inside you. In the next part, we will talk about why trying to fix yourself often makes the disconnection worse, and why reconnecting with yourself requires a very different kind of courage. Not the courage to add more to your life, but the courage to remove what never belonged to you in the first place. One of the biggest mistakes people make when trying to find themselves again is treating it as a self-improvement project. They think something is broken, something must be fixed, something must be optimized. So they add more routines, more goals, more knowledge, more pressure to become better. But the more they add, the more distant they feel. Because the problem was never that you were not enough. The problem was that too much was placed on top of who you already were. You learned to be responsible. You learned to be useful. You learned to be reliable. All good things. But somewhere along the way, you learned to ignore yourself in order to maintain those things. And that habit became automatic. Finding yourself again does not require intensity. It requires honesty. Honesty about what drains you. Honesty about what you tolerate. Honesty about what no longer feels true, even if it once made sense. This is difficult because it threatens the structure of your life. You built stability around adaptation. If you start listening to yourself again, you may have to change things that feel safe. There is a woman named Lena. She lived a life that looked successful from the outside, but inside, she felt constantly tired, not physically, but emotionally. Every role she played felt slightly misaligned. She thought she needed a break, or motivation, or inspiration. What she actually needed was permission. Permission to say no without explaining. Permission to disappoint others a little. Permission to admit that some choices were no longer hers. The real self does not shout, it whispers. And you cannot hear a whisper in a life filled with constant noise and obligation. That is why reconnecting with yourself often begins with subtraction. Less explaining, less pleasing, less forcing yourself to fit where you no longer belong. This does not mean becoming selfish. It means becoming accurate. Accurate about what you feel. Accurate about what you can cut. Accurate about what costs you too much to maintain. In the next part, we will explore how to rebuild trust with yourself. Because losing yourself is not only about forgetting who you are, it is also about breaking an internal relationship. And finding yourself again requires earning that trust back, slowly and patiently. When you lose yourself, you also lose trust in yourself. Not trust in a dramatic sense, but in a very quiet, everyday way. You stop believing that your feelings matter. You stop believing that your boundaries are valid. You stop believing that listening to yourself will lead anywhere good. And so, even when your inner voice tries to speak, you doubt it. Maybe I am overreacting. Maybe I am being ungrateful. Maybe this is just a phase. That doubt is not accidental. It was learned. Every time you ignored discomfort to keep the peace. Every time you stayed silent to avoid conflict. Every time you told yourself to endure instead of respond. You taught yourself that your inner signals were not reliable. So finding yourself again is not just about remembering who you are. It is about rebuilding a relationship that was neglected for a very long time. And like any broken relationship, it cannot be repaired with one grand gesture. It requires consistency. You rebuild trust with yourself by doing very small things and honoring them. Saying no when something feels wrong, even if it is uncomfortable. Leaving when your body tells you to leave. Resting when you are tired without turning it into guilt. These actions may look insignificant from the outside, but internally, they send a powerful message. I am listening now. At first, it will feel strange, even scary. because you are breaking a long-standing pattern of self-abandonment. You may fear that if you listen to yourself too much, everything will fall apart, that you will become selfish, that you will disappoint people. But what actually happens is different. You become calmer, clearer, more grounded. Because when you are no longer constantly betraying yourself, your nervous system begins to relax. The tension that came from living against yourself slowly fades. There is a moment when you realize something important. The exhaustion you felt was not from doing too much. It was from doing too much of what was not aligned. Rebuilding trust with yourself is not about perfection. You will still hesitate. You will still sometimes ignore yourself out of habit. That is normal. What matters is that you notice. And each time you notice and return, even gently, the connection grows stronger. In the final part, we will talk about what it really means to find yourself again. Not as a fixed identity, not as a final answer, but as a living relationship you continue to choose every day. Finding yourself again is not a destination. It is not a moment where everything suddenly makes sense. It is not a final version of who you are. It is a relationship you return to again and again after years of ignoring it. Many people expect that once they find themselves, life will become clear and easy. The decisions will be obvious, that doubts will disappear. But that expectation is another illusion. The real self is not a fixed answer. It is a living signal. Some days it is clear. Some days it is quiet. Some days it changes. And that is not a failure. That is being human. Finding yourself again means you stop outsourcing your inner authority. You stop asking the world to tell you who you are allowed to be. You stop measuring yourself only by external roles and achievements. Instead, you build a simple habit. You check in. How do I actually feel? What is costing me too much right now? What feels true even if it is inconvenient? You may not always act on the answer immediately. Sometimes life does not allow it. But the difference is this: you no longer ignore the answer, and that alone changes everything. Over time, you notice a shift. You are less dramatic about your life, less lost in extremes. You no longer feel the same urgency to define yourself because you are present with yourself. You stop asking, who am I supposed to be? You start asking, am I being honest right now? And honesty, repeated daily, becomes identity. There will still be pressure. There will still be expectations. There will still be moments when you drift. But now you know the way back. Not through searching, not through fixing, but through listening. The self you are looking for is not ahead of you. It is beneath the layers you learned to survive. And every time you choose to respond instead of endure, to speak instead of disappear, to rest instead of force, you are not becoming someone new. You are returning. And that is what it truly means to find yourself again.